Hi, I am Emmy. Welcome to Emmy's Rabbit Holes. This is my channel where I go over my recent hyperfixations. And my most recent hyperfixation has been thinking about kind of this male loneliness epidemic and the amount of bad dating advice that exists for young men currently. What initially sparked this hyperfixation for me was a video that I got on TikTok from somebody who identified himself as having formerly been in the Manosphere and no longer is. And it was really interesting to see his takes on some things. And one of the problems that he identified was that it's really hard to find genuine dating advice from sort of like ordinary people, like real women. I'll share the video and, of course, link it in the description. But he was essentially saying that when he tried asking the women in his life that he liked and respected what they would advise for him, they really only said things like, be a nice guy and just be yourself. And he was already doing those things and was feeling like they weren't working. And so he was like confused and frustrated with that kind of generic advice that didn't really feel like advice, which I think is so fair. And so then he turned to the internet and ended up slowly in Manosphere content. So just thinking about that vacuum that exists, and I thought I would try to fill that a little bit today.
So I got a question. Are we ready to admit yet that the Manosphere exists for a reason? This isn't a defense of it. I don't think it should. And in fact, the main reason I started this account was to fight back against it. But can we collectively admit that something this ugly with this much staying power does serve a purpose? Because anytime I see a video where somebody inches towards a modicum of understanding as to why something like this might exist, they just thoughtlessly write it off as standard garden variety misogyny and move on with their day, having unveiled no real information and conferring no real value to the rest of us to understanding why we've gotten here. So let's start with that, because I think the most common and most harmful misunderstanding about the Manosphere is that it exists to amplify a pre-existing hatred of women in the men who get sucked into it. And as a man who did get sucked into it 15 years ago, nothing could be further from the truth. I have, since I was a child, firmly believed that men and women were equal, and I have primarily been friends with and gotten along with and been close to women. The one thing people do seem to get right is I was pretty unsuccessful romantically, and I was very frustrated about that. So the first thing that I did is talk to the women I knew, and even look online for advice from women in what I might be getting wrong. And this is not something that's unique to me. Nearly every man that I have talked to or seen talk about their entry into the Manosphere or the Red Pill has had the same first step, that they have either talked to or looked to women online for advice on what they should do. And all of us got the same answers back. Just be yourself, or just be nice. Which, in case you're wondering why we have this scourge of nice guys who believe that is enough for them to be attractive to somebody, it is because that is what they were told was the only thing they needed to do. Now, before anyone gets upset about what I've just said, I need you to understand that I don't care. This is an informative video, not a criticism nor a defense of anything. Let's stay on topic. Having failed to glean any useful advice from the women I talked to on this topic, I decided the next best place to look would be men who seem to be successful. This is where a lot of people like to hack together an analogy about fish and fishermen, but I think the reality is that we just think a lot less about what attracts us to other people than what attracts other people to us. But this right here is the Trojan horse, because for most men, again, at least the ones who get sucked into this is the first time in their life that they have gotten good, useful advice on how to be more compelling and attractive to women. Because it's not just be yourself or be more confident or go to the gym. It is, here is a step-by-step guide on what could make you more socially compelling. You need to go to the gym. Here is a good starter program. Here is what you're looking for. You need better style? Great. Here are some examples of what look better. This is a thoroughly fleshed out guide on how to be more attractive and compelling as a man. And not all of the advice is good, and oftentimes they will give the wrong reason for why the good advice does work. But this is the first time in my life that I got advice on the subject that actually worked. And from there, it's a steady stream of indoctrination, where they use their position as the first person to give you good advice to convince you that everyone else gave you bad advice because they don't care, because they don't want you to succeed, because you're just not good enough in their eyes, and therefore, this community is all you have. They use the fact that the advice women gave you didn't work and the formulas that they gave you did as evidence that women supposedly lack agency. And they use the existence of this broadly anti-man content, which, don't kid yourself, is out there, as evidence that women hate you. So all you're doing is protecting yourself. I've spent a good amount of time learning about these tactics over the last 10 years, and this is not unique to the Manosphere. This is the basic playbook of indoctrination. But as long as we pretend that male loneliness is something that they deserve, that the only men who aren't successful in their dating lives are men who hate women or are seeking to use them, then we guarantee that they have nowhere to go except for the people who will teach them to do just that. And if you tell yourself that this only works on weak people and it could never happen to you, then all you're doing is making sure that you are the perfect target.
I want to start out with just like laying my own experience out there. I'm not any sort of therapist. I'm not somebody who has struggled with dating all that much. So I know that can seem unfair in a certain way. I've been with my husband since my teens. I'm now 34. So I recognize that I have a lot of privilege here. And also, I'm somebody who just kind of has like a pretty ordinary relationship. And I feel like that is not an area where you often hear people talking about relationship advice. I feel like people who give relationship advice tend to kind of be atypical people. And so while in a way that's a disadvantage, I hope it also can be an advantage. I also want to state that my interest in this has just come from really an interest in what's going on in our world today. I have some nephews who are teens and in their 20s, and I still hope to become a mother myself. Male loneliness epidemic, or whatever else we want to call this issue that a lot of young men are having with finding partners, is unfortunate. And I think that the issues that young men are having and the issues that young women are having are not at all unrelated. And I think it's kind of rare to see content that tries to like bridge that gap. I'll go into it more later in this video, but overall I feel like my relationship really disproves a lot of the beliefs and concepts that the Manosphere teaches as kind of being how reality works. So I think that's part of where I want to speak from as well. But first, I want to get into that idea of why people, maybe especially women, do tend to give men that advice of be nice and be yourself. My mind immediately goes to how some men end up feeling very frustrated in thinking that women don't actually want nice guys, and yet that is the common advice that is given. I think there is way more nuance there than what we often contribute to that conversation. On one hand, I think women are attempting to give advice. They genuinely mean that it is a good thing to be yourself and to be kind. And also, what they are saying and what men who hear that advice are hearing are two different languages. I think what a lot of people mean by be yourself is that a common issue in dating is if you go on a date with somebody and you can tell that they are trying to be anything other than authentic, that can feel very unsettling and maybe even a little scary. It can feel a little threatening, like, who is this person really? Are they trying to trick me? Are they trying to manipulate me or something like that? And when we sense that somebody is being authentic, that really can give a sense of safety and just an ability to truly connect with that person as they truly are in a way that you just can't do when somebody is performing or masking. And so I think that's what women are trying to convey. And on the other hand, I think what a lot of men hear is something like, you don't have to try, or like, don't put any intention behind your behavior, just show up, completely wing it, and it'll be great. And I think that there's a lot of space between those two ideas, or at least there can be. There can be a meaningful difference between putting forth intentional effort and being somebody you're not. And it's definitely a nuanced thing. And I think part of figuring out that difference requires you to really know yourself on a level that isn't always easy to know. Like, where is the line between trying to perhaps be my best self versus pretending to be something I'm not. It definitely can be nuanced. Something else that I think isn't validated nearly enough in the world that we live in is that men absorb an in-proportionate amount of rejection in the dating scene, because the world that we live in, it still puts more of an expectation on men to be the one to ask women on a date. Obviously, I'm largely assuming for this whole video that we're talking about straight men and women, but rejection is brutal, or it certainly can feel really brutal, and it's just unfair that the world we live in does expect men to ask, and because they are the ones who are expected to ask, that puts them in a situation of having to hear no more often than women do, and that sucks. That definitely sucks. And also, I think so many of us grow up not really learning in-depth emotional skills. For example, parents often say things like when their kid is bullied, oh, they're just jealous of you, rather than teaching the kid how to like sit with and deal with the fact that not everybody likes you. And while I think that skill is often lacking in any gender, I think it's harder for men because they are put in this position of having to face rejection more often. And it's easy for me to see how experiencing that emotional pain can lead people down different paths to try to convince themselves that it's not worth it anymore, and to just feel like they need to just stop trying for the sake of avoiding that pain because it's just too overwhelming for them. Sometimes people act like this male loneliness thing isn't real, and that's just not true. One study from 1990 showed that only 3% of men indicated that they didn't have any friends, and now that number is 15%. And so the amount of isolation that men are experiencing has unquestionably increased. And while that problem is very real, there are unquestionably bad actors who have stepped in to take advantage of that emotional pain for the sake of monetizing and who knows what other purposes. Overall, what really stands out to me when looking at a lot of Manosphere or other shady dating advice online is so much of it focuses on initial attraction and not on what actually makes somebody good at relationships, especially long-term relationships. I am certainly not here to say that attraction doesn't matter, because it certainly does, at least to some degree for the vast majority of people. But to me, one of the biggest lies in most of this content is this idea that that is where your value lies in a man, is in how tall you are, how much money you make, what kind of a car you have, the shape of your jaw, how much time you spend at the gym. And that is nonsense. Your value was decided the day that you were born. It is not something that you can earn, and it is not something that you can lose. Humans inherently have value. And while I think the vast majority of people who are in relationships, myself included, would say that their partner caught their eye visually, that they thought they were hot or sexy or cute or handsome, some variation of that, that's true. And that is not at all what sustains a relationship. And I think most of the time, it's not even what sustains a relationship for the first few weeks even. So let's get into some actual advice. If you find yourself wanting advice from the women in your life, the common way that men would ask that is, what should I do to get a girlfriend? And that's often when you're gonna get advice like, just be yourself, be nice, just put yourself out there, those kinds of things. And I think that a better question, especially for women who are in relationships, would be to ask them what drew you to your partner, and what like really got you hooked in deep, what has made your relationship work. Because I think when asked that question of why did you fall for your partner, you are far more likely to get a more detailed answer, because the pressure is just different when trying to give advice to a friend versus when talking about what has already worked for you. My experience when talking to people about their love stories is that they don't say things like, he made $100,000 a year, or that he had really attractive biceps. There might be some element of, like I said, he was hot or something like that. But often the actual anecdotes of what really made them melt was something emotional, and often it's some way that either shows deep authenticity and or safety. For example, people will often have stories like, on our first date, we went to get ice cream and I got the ice cream all over my dress and I was so embarrassed. But his response to that was to tell me about a time that he ruined his clothes. And it just made me feel so much better that he didn't judge me whatsoever. And like my embarrassment just immediately faded. I just loved that about him, that he was almost effortlessly able to make me feel comfortable with him, even in this really awkward situation. Or a story like, on my second date, he remembered this tiny detail of a story that I had told on the first date that I had forgot I even told him about. And it just made me realize that he was really, really paying attention to me and that he really cared about who I am and what I like. And that just made our connection feel really deep pretty early on. Overall, I think you will find that the moments that really cause people to go from, sure, I would go on a date with this guy, to I want this person to be my person, is often genuine presence, genuinely feeling somebody's interest in you, genuinely connecting over shared values, shared interests, a sense of safety, a sense of familiarity. And I think what's unfortunate with a lot of advice that is out there around dating is that it really is encouraging people to perform more. And when we are performing, there isn't vulnerability. And when there isn't vulnerability, there can't be deep connection and safety. It's like performing puts this wall, this like glass wall between two people, and that isn't going to allow for the type of connection that you really want to experience in order to move into really wanting to continue dating this person. And what sucks about that is so many people, but especially men, are taught that vulnerability is going to make them look weak, is going to make them look bad, is going to make women not like them. In part of this hyperfixation, I was talking to one of my friends, and she was saying that she will never forget, as a young woman, being floored when somebody told her that they had a really close relationship with their niece, but that they tried not to disclose that when going on dates because they thought that women would judge them for being too nurturing. And she just thought that that was almost funny because she loves nurturing guys, and she knew that she wanted to have kids someday, and so guys who are good with kids was something that was specifically an appeal to her. And she's like, I feel like that's true for a whole lot of women, and yet that's not the only man I know who thinks that being soft or nurturing, caring is going to be off-putting. And she was saying that she thinks that where that narrative really comes from is ironically other men. And I think that that might be right, because I do think that men tend to have that fear around other men. So I think that's just something maybe to try to keep an eye on too, is that sometimes the narratives that get shared about what women want, when they are repeated from other men, they often are quite separated from what real women want. Men don't always know what women want, but some men who don't know what women want will still give out advice as if they do know. I also just want to speak to how, kind of a lot like rejection, vulnerability is scary. And so I completely understand why a lot of people have an impulse to perform while going on a date, because it can feel like that is a safer way to go about the situation. It feels less risky to your own heart and your own emotions. But because that hinders the ability to deeply connect, it actually isn't the right strategy. If you find yourself in a position where the idea of trying to risk vulnerability feels inaccessible in relationships to you, I would think that that could be part of what is hindering your process with trying to date, is just trying to connect with people. And I think we often think of romantic relationships as like a completely different universe from friendships and other relationships, but there are a lot of skills and experiences that can and do overlap. If you find that you don't have friendships where you are experiencing vulnerability, then trying to experiment with vulnerability in friendships or in family relationships, if those are relatively safe people for you, can be a way to practice that, perhaps without the intensity of rejection that you might experience feeling within dating. If you find yourself doubting some of the stuff that I'm saying, and if you find the narratives related to height and muscles and weight and those sorts of things to be particularly compelling, my advice would be to consider the people around you, ordinary people in our real lives. My marriage defies the manosphere concepts, not in every way, but in plenty of ways on both sides. I clearly not a model-esque woman. My husband is tall. He doesn't live at the gym. He doesn't make $100,000 a year. We're both kind of nerdy, introverted, neurodivergent people. I don't mean at all to say that like we have everything figured out. Like, we certainly don't. We have our issues like anybody else. But my relationship is one of the things in my life that I'm the most proud of. We've put a lot of intentionality into it, and it is one of the greater sources of joy in my life. Among the things that I would list as loving the most about him is how emotionally intelligent he is and how safe he has always been for me. My own version of what made me first really, really fall for him is in the first week or two of us dating. He had been over at my house. I was a teenager still living at home. And, but it was just the two of us there at the time. Without thinking twice about it, we were cooking together and cutting up some potatoes. And I just started singing this song about potatoes that I had like just made up in my head, and just it came like right out of my mouth. And I had always been an extremely reserved, shy person. When I was a kid, my family used to go to karaoke, and I have never in my life sang a song at karaoke. So for me to sing in front of somebody, especially somebody who I was newly dating, was just so out of the norm for me, to be that relaxed and that unfiltered. And ironically, like after he left that night, I kind of panicked, like, what is wrong with me that I like am not like controlling myself more, or that I am kind of exposing myself this much. It was scary to me. It was really scary to me, to be that genuine and that open with him. But also the fact that I did just open up to him so effortlessly was such an attractive thing to me. The level of safety that he was able to convey for me, just through how like loving and understanding he was and how non-judgmental he was, put me in this space where, even though I usually was like hyper aware of my behavior and trying to like be normal and not let my weirdness out, with him it would have taken more effort to mask all of that, because I don't know, my walls just like naturally dropped around him because of how safe he was. And that was one of those moments where I knew that this was really, really something special, that I was able to be more of myself with him than I had ever been with anybody before. And that has only continued throughout our relationship. We started dating very young. Neither of us came from particularly privileged families. Like, neither of us had help with college or anything like that. And so we've struggled together financially. And ironically, that's another thing that has worked for us, because we both have been self-employed for most of our relationship together. We both have a real passion for trying to be self-employed and small business. Even though we do different things, there's enough commonality there. We really love being able to prioritize having jobs that we enjoy, or at least don't hate, and also being able to spend our time more of how and when we want to, like being able to set our own schedule and things like that, over making the most money possible. And so that's just one area of life where our values really aligned. I think that having shared core values is a really critical part of making long-term relationships work. I was analyzing at one point why these common ideas that things like women don't want to date any man that's under 5'9", over 200 pounds or 250 pounds or whatever the weight limit is, or that's under a certain weight, or that's too nerdy or too awkward, or doesn't make at least $50,000 a year or whatever. Like, why do those messages prevail when, if I go out into public in my local community, and granted I live in a relatively low cost of living area, kind of rural, lots of blue collar workers, but it's clearly true that lots of short men, fat men, non-muscular men, low income men still have partners and long-term relationships. And so where does this narrative come from that you have to be all of these things in order to find a partner? And I think part of why that message prevails is the experience of dating apps. I don't have experience with dating apps, but from friends and other people, I know that the way that these profiles work and these kind of like ideals or expectations, the way that they're listed out, it can feel that way. Men are approaching and the women filtering through a lot of messages, and so their experience is really different on an app than the man's is. And when looking at a whole bunch of profiles, there is so little ability to see what true connection there is or true chemistry there is, and it really does kind of reduce things to these really artificial traits. And I don't think that is at all a very good representation of the real world. I want to speak on rejection a bit, because I think part of what can really get into people's heads is their repeated experiences with rejection. And as I said earlier, I think rejection is brutally painful for most people, and most of us have really limited skills on knowing how to deal with that. And so it can be crazy making, and I think that's so valid. And I think a big part of why rejection can feel as painful as it does, because so many people are taught that rejection means so much more than it does. An experience that I've had with friends is when they try going on a date and it doesn't go very well, I've noticed that they tend to assume the reason that he didn't like her or didn't want a second date was the exact thing that she is the most insecure about. Point that I've tried making to my friends is, you're kind of assuming why things didn't quite click, and the answer that you're filling in that gap is the thing that you're the most insecure about, which I think is a really human tendency to do that. So like, let's say my friend is 5'9" and she is insecure about being a taller woman. She might then assume that the reason the date didn't go so great was her height. And it might have absolutely nothing to do with her height. It could be that he didn't like some other shallow thing about her, like the clothing she wore. It could be that he liked her but didn't feel chemistry the way that he thought he would. It could be that she didn't kiss him and he wanted somebody who was gonna go to bed with him really fast. It also could be something that he couldn't fully articulate, even if he was trying to be fully honest. It could be, I don't quite know. There's nothing really about her that I dislike, but I just wasn't feeling it. Like, that just didn't feel like my person. Unfortunately, with dating, you almost never know, because even if you were to try to ask somebody what they didn't like about you or what didn't work, a lot of times people aren't going to give the full truth, and I think a lot of times people don't even fully know. I think sometimes what makes us want to be with somebody is kind of beyond our own conscious awareness to a degree. But another way of looking at this is, let's say that you wanted to find a lifelong best friend rather than a romantic partner, and you went out into some sort of public space, maybe a skate park, maybe the library, maybe some gaming store, whatever your thing is, and you start trying to strike up a conversation with somebody. Maybe even you try several people, and then you ask them if they want to hang out with you again next week. A lot of those people are probably going to say no. And even if they don't say no, the odds of those people truly ending up becoming your lifelong best friend is really rare. Not because there's anything wrong with you, but because finding a really deep, long-lasting connection is kind of rare. And that sucks, but it's just kind of a matter of numbers. And I think it's easy to think something like, I've went on 10 dates this year and none of them ended up being my person. There must be something wrong with me, or there's something wrong with all women. And I think it's far more likely that you just haven't found the right person yet, and that it really has nothing to do with any sort of inherent failure in you personally. But I think because so many of us struggle with tolerating rejection, it can really just make us want to not try, because it's so difficult to keep trying to be vulnerable and keep risking that pain. But I think it's really important to really try to not let yourself take any negative experiences, or just not positive experiences with dating, as any sort of deep meaning about who you are. We don't get our worth from the people that we date. As I said earlier, worth is just an inherent thing that people have, but our culture doesn't like to tell us that. And I think it really harms both genders, because men get this message that if you're a valuable man, all of these women will swarm to you. And at the same time, that's not really a compliment to women either, because on the woman's side of it, it's like, your value is in your beauty and in your sexuality, rather than in your personality and in your values and in like you as a whole complete person, holistic person. It really is quite objectifying on both sides. And I think it's bullshit on both sides. The dating scenario is just really set up to invoke all of these insecurities of, do I have worth? How do I earn worth through getting people to like me? It almost kind of reminds me of job interviews and how easy it is to feel really small or really unworthy when applying to jobs and not hearing back, or when getting an interview and not hearing back. It's just this kind of nasty situation where it feels like your worth is being determined by somebody from this really really shallow and critical list of traits. And I don't think that that actually is what's happening in dating specifically, but it absolutely can feel like that. I think the reality of what's actually happening is just you're trying to suss out how much you have in common, and how compatible you are. And a lot of times the answer is you're not right for each other. And we twist that into thinking that means they're saying I don't have value. And that's really just not what's being decided there. Another whole category that I wanted to cover was just the idea of relationship skills, because I don't think that this is talked about in like dating content hardly at all, but also it's just not talked about enough in society in general. When my partner and I started dating when we were young, neither of us came from families that taught us emotional regulation skills or conflict resolution skills. If you heard that, that was my cat. Negotiation skills. And so I think a whole lot of people find themselves as young adults attempting to date and not knowing how to bring me your mousey. Thank you. And while I think it's true that people in general just aren't taught these things as kids, I think boys are often put at a particular disadvantage. I've like heard of studies like girls are talked to more, they're sang to more, like there's just all kinds of unconscious sexist stuff and impacts parenting, even with parents who are trying to be very unsexist in their parenting. It's just the cultural stuff gets in and we don't even recognize it a lot of the time, unfortunately. But boys are less likely to be taught things like how to have respectful conflict with somebody, how to express your emotions in ways that feel good to you, but also that feel safe for the other person. These are things that my husband and I have both chosen to intentionally learn. We both do therapy. We also do couples therapy. The difference that it can make in a relationship is really profound. even though prior to this, like, we never had a like toxic relationship. We weren't like screaming or calling each other's names or having, you know, nasty fights or anything like that. We still just didn't always know how to cope with things in a way that made the most sense, and how to make each other feel seen and heard and respected while actively disagreeing with each other. For people who initially get in relationships but then they don't last, I think a lot of times that is a lack of relational skill. And while it's a bummer when we're not taught those things as kids, they are things that you can learn at any age. And something that's kind of cool about those things is we can practice those skills in any relationship. It doesn't have to be a dating or romantic relationship. Like, if you have a roommate and you're struggling with them not like taking out the trash when they said they were, and you have a tendency to just take it out yourself because you are afraid of conflict, like, that's an example where you could practice working on direct communication and ways to absolve conflict without without having to just avoid it, and without having to like take on that responsibility yourself, and without like hurting your friend or disrespecting your friend. And part of why I think that this is really important is I think that one of the more common like genuine complaints that women have about dating is trying to find men that they feel are on their level or close to their level with emotional awareness and emotional regulation and communication skills. And so I don't think that that is at all men's fault that they aren't taught those things. I think that is a cultural problem and a sexism problem. However, I do think that if you intentionally practice those skills and improve those skills, that is really beneficial to your chances in relationships, especially long term. And all of that being said, you don't have to arrive to a relationship like perfect or completely skilled on anything. Part of any relationship is growing together and learning together, and everybody's going to make mistakes. Patience is needed on both sides. My own experience is that I can have so much more respect and patience and willingness to work with somebody in a relationship if I can see that they are genuinely dedicated to working on anything that is hurting me or that is causing us problems. And of course, I take it very seriously that I want to show up with the same level of commitment to working on my side of things. On one hand, I think that compatibility is real. Having your core values shared is pretty key, but also, like, no two people are going to be perfectly aligned. Having a relationship that lasts isn't about not having areas where you differ, maybe even where you can't find perfect resolution on certain things. Like, I think that's pretty common. And trying to be aware of and considerate of how you impact somebody else, and just an openness to improving your self-awareness, to working on being the most emotionally safe person that you can be for somebody, being as accepting as you can be, regulating your own emotions. All things that are not literally essential, but that certainly can make long-term relationships far healthier and far happier versus when people just kind of arrive in a relationship and neither person or only one person is willing to keep working on themselves. Then I think that's where you tend to get locked in patterns and resentment builds, and problems can really fester. In closing, one of my biggest pieces of advice when dating is to try not to go into dating asking yourself, how do I get somebody to choose me? Because that will push you towards feeling like you need to perform, and also you're kind of conveying that something is inherently wrong with you as you are, and that is not true. Instead, if you truly feel like you're in a situation now where it's impossible or nearly impossible for somebody to choose you, then another way of looking at that would be, how can I become somebody who is good in relationships, who would be who would have these relationship skills, who would be a good long-term partner. And at the same time, if you really feel like nobody would ever choose you, that says so much more about your self-esteem and your self-identity than it does your actual traits. Because there's nothing inherently wrong with you. And when we believe that, or when we are self-loathing, or when we feel less than or inferior or unworthy, that just screams trauma. And trauma can be healed, self-esteem can be worked on. But what's really tricky with having low self-esteem or having trauma that has impacted our sense of self is that it sure can feel really real, especially when we take something like rejection as evidence. See, I don't have value and nobody does want me. But that's really a distortion that trauma causes. If you really feel like you don't have anything to offer somebody else in a romantic partnership, that really speaks to how much you don't fully know yourself yet. And so that is another factor to this, is learning your values, learning your good traits. I think a common experience that people have when trying to start therapy, therapists often ask, like, what do you like about yourself? Or like, what are your strengths? A lot of people really struggle to answer that question. And when you struggle to answer that question, that says a lot about your view of yourself, and that's going to impact how you show up in relationships. And so it is not about becoming something more worthy, but about kind of discovering who you really are under any like self-loathing, self-doubt, intense self-criticism. Keep in mind that people of all sorts find relationships all of the time. And sometimes it truly does happen when you least expect it. And try to be mindful of these systems on the internet, and I'm sure they exist in real life too, of people who are trying to exploit your emotional pain for their financial benefit. Any of these systems that are sending you a message that you have to check off this really specific list of things in order to have value as a husband or as a boyfriend are feeding you lower self-worth. And almost certainly they are exploiting that in some way. Try listening to the voice in you, no matter how small it is, that knows that your value is not based in these shallow ideals, and that knows that there is great value in your true self and that you're somebody worthy of connecting with. This is my cat Pepperoni. I'm sure some would see it as cheesy, but authenticity and love and connection are really the answer to all of this. And so anything that pushes away from that and encourages performance, low self-esteem, disconnection, judgment, it's not going to lead you where you want to go. If you got anything out of this video, I would love if you would subscribe to me so that I can, a million years from now, get monetized. I will see you in my next video. Bye. Pepperoni says bye too.